You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Paula DiPerna to talk about her new book, Pricing the Priceless. We chat about how nature is working for us for free and how we should value those services, as well as financial mechanisms we could use to save the planet. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Talking Headways podcast, especially through your podcatchers. With the unfortunate news that Stitcher will stop operations on August 29th, we hope you'll continue to listen on other services. You can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, and many, many more. We'll put our RSS feed in the show notes if that helps you make the switch. Thanks again for listening to Talking Headways. We really do appreciate it, especially those of you who keep coming back each and every week. Well, Paula DiPerna, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much. Love the name.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a city person. I grew up in New York City and I'm a product of the New York City public schools. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I can give you the names of my high school, English teachers, like many writers can. I did my graduate and undergraduate work at New York University. And then I volunteered to work for Jacques Cousteau as a writer, thinking it would be just a very short gig. I was freelancing at that point, writing about public schools. And they hired me the next day for a book project. And I ended up staying there for 20 years or so, becoming his right-hand person for policy and also a film writer. And so then I traveled all over the world to many, many cities. I've been involved with environmental issues pretty much since then, and I've seen them from literally coral reefs to carbon markets and now further. And that's me, really. I mean, I'm a writer, and that's not much more to say.
Well, that's pretty important. How did you get into the environment? Usually I ask folks, how do they got into city planning or transportation planning? But for you, I think the most apt question is, how did you become invested in the environment? And I imagine, being involved with Jacques Cousteau is a major reason why. But before that, were you a kid when you started thinking about these issues?
Good question. I mean, before that, cities, as you know, are ecosystems in themselves. And before that, and I grew up in the North Bronx, which was, part of New York City, but was on the edge of Westchester County. And so we had a huge public park. And this speaks to the importance of public infrastructure, I think. I mean, Pelham Bay Park, which when New York was vying for the Olympics, it was able to point to a number of pre-existing structures and facilities that had been built in New York City long before the bid that were literally Olympic in size and stature. And one of them was this Pelham Bay Park, which is still there. And my parents always took us there, but to picnic and to play baseball, not to sort of be among nature. So nature for me was kind of a scenery, really. And I really didn't have an interest. My favorite aunt had a bungalow in the country, again, a little bit north of Manhattan. We used to go on weekends there, and I learned about her garden and things and birds a little bit, but it still wasn't integral. And honestly, when I volunteered to work for Cousteau, it was for my own self-purpose, which was to learn a little bit more about the environment so I could write about it. I still wasn't animated by any particular passion, you could say. And I'm not so sure even now. I mean, now I'm very animated by passion, but I'm still not a big outdoors person. I don't go camping every weekend, It's more than the outdoors. I'm not an outdoors mentality type. I'm much more of an ecosystem systems type, if you see the difference.
Of course. And I think that's really important. You've been all over the world and looked at all kinds of different ecosystems. I'm wondering if any of them stand out specifically.
Well, I have to say, I'm not a diver. I never learned to dive, partly because I don't think I have the personality. I think if I got in trouble, I would probably bob
Me
up to
too.
the surface and, kill myself, get an embolism, because I'm not that calm, if something were to happen, even though I know diving is pretty safe. But I did work on Cousteau films a lot, and seeing that footage of those coral reefs was mind boggling. To see the delicacy and the colors and the amazing design, back again to, design and urban design. The coral reefs are just breathtaking and unique, obviously. And then the other one that stands out, really, I have to say, was the Amazon. You think about trees and animals, but what blew my mind was the water. The way water is really the rainforest, falling water from the sky, water rising from the flooding. And the experience of being in a zodiac with a couple of film guys, rowing and just keeping rowing, and then the next thing you know, you're at the top of the trees because you have been carried up by this amazing amount of water in the rivers, and you didn't really understand how the rivers were very high, how high they were. They were as high as almost the top of the trees, and that was mind-boggling. And I guess the other one that stands out is Botswana, where in the book, I talk about the rhino bond and about my trip to Botswana. And that was also breathtaking. That, wildlife is a bit of a cliche, but until you've seen it. And the thing that stood out really was how huge Africa is and how large the areas are. And when you think, you hear, 30,000 elephants, it sounds like a lot. But when you think about whatever remaining populations there are being distributed in these huge areas, you realize it's just super few animals. And when you get to see them, it is also breathtaking. So I guess those would be my three, one through film and the other two physical contact.
I love it. And I agree that if you come into contact with something that's really amazing and you see it, it just really changes your perspective. I know here in California, going to Yosemite is one of those experiences, I think, for a lot of people, or even just seeing a sequoia for the first time. The size of a tree can really, leave you breathless to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I've been there too, and certainly Lake Quinault, in Washington State, Olympic National Forest. These. I remember I took my nephew, and he was very young; he was about 7 or 8, and we were in the Olympic National Forest outside of Seattle, and there were all these gigantic trees, and a couple of them were broken. And he says to me, "How's that for splinters, Aunt Paula?" A splinter that was, 3 feet long. And you realize that's how a 7-year-old would see it. And it was unforgettable, obviously.
It's awesome. Well, that gets to the point of the book, Pricing the Priceless, the financial transformation to value the planet, solve the climate crisis, and protect our most precious assets. We're just talking about precious assets and pricelessness to a certain extent. I'm wondering, what got you to write this book? What was the impetus?
Well, that does a bit go back to Cousteau because, as I mentioned in the preface of the book, when I was working with him when the Exxon Valdez ran aground, which of course was a while ago, but at the time was the largest oil spill, I think, in American history, up in Prince William Sound, which was, and I think still is, fairly pristine. And there was, super tragedy of the oil being not only lost from the ship, but also the wildlife. There was so much wildlife up there, unlike Africa, Prince William Sound, very compact. And so otters and seabirds and all this wildlife were just swimming into the oil, or the oil was swimming into them. And it was awful, visually awful, and the news was full of it. And people, crews of people, when you think about rescuing human beings at sea and what happens these days with people drowning in ferry boats. But at that time, people by the hundreds went up to Alaska to rescue the wildlife and clean up the wildlife. And Cousteau didn't seem personally too responsive to that. He didn't, he was sad about it. But I said, how come you don't want to come up? We're going to make a film up there. How come you're not coming up? And he said, well, Jean-Michel and you can do it. I don't have to come. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, I don't think the crime, it's very sad, but the crime is really taking the oil out of the ground at today's price. And he was already thinking about oil being, it's very, very early on climate change. And he knew about fossil fuels intimately well as a problem. And he was thinking, here's America digging out the oil of Alaska, putting it in a ship, sailing it around the whole North American continent through the Panama Canal. To what end and at what price? So that kind of put the thing in my head. But honestly, the real impetus for the book was gadgetry. I just became aware that suddenly our society was almost like in a doodad economy where, everybody's cell phone had to be the next version, and, next spread coffee. I travel a lot, I go to hotels a lot. All I want to have is a cup of coffee. And it used to be super easy to get a cup of coffee. Now it's Nespresso and Koenig and all these different kinds of coffee makers, a huge amount of mechanist, plastic, metal to get a thimble full of coffee. Crazy. But the thing that really I thought was super crazy was Uber. Not that I'm against Uber or have any reason or right to be against anything. It's just that people were so fascinated with Uber. The first time I saw it was at a hotel in Dublin, and this guy was showing me on his phone, or rather the first time I heard about it was in Dublin. And everyone was so excited there was going to be this new system. You could just call and immediately a car would appear. And I thought, well, okay, big deal. So you used to be able to get a taxi immediately. And I didn't see the difference. But suddenly Uber became a company and it became valued, and it was, up like WeWork, all these sort of software, non-tangible companies that are totally dispensable were being valued by Wall Street in the billions of dollars. And by dispensable, I mean, we don't actually need them. People work for them. There is some need of them now, but we could live without them. Whereas the atmosphere, which we cannot live without, we don't value at all. We value at zero. So it suddenly began the dichotomy of this. And I had dabbled a bit in ecosystem services, of course, all through my career with Cousteau. So I knew that there were these things called externalities. I'd written about that even myself, these, economic factors that influence economic value, but which are not on the books, which are considered external to the classic profit and loss. So it sort of all came together, I would say, during the Paris discussions, and when it just became so obvious that we weren't going anywhere in terms of getting a grip on climate change. And then I was quite involved with carbon markets, and that was really the clincher, I have to say.
That's really interesting. And I'll ask you about the Pope in a second, but that's an interesting discussion about, people and carbon markets and trust, if they have it or don't have it. And the idea I think that I took away from reading the book too is this idea that people have of air as real estate rather than a precious resource. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on that idea and why that's important.
Well, it's a paradox, but the atmosphere is about 60 miles above us before there's nothing protecting us from solar heat. And so it sounds terribly crass to consider it real estate, but on the other hand, it's an extremely scarce space. And so by pricing it, we're not pricing it, we're pricing the scarcity, really, in a cap and trade or a carbon market. And under the laws of supply and demand, you would assume that the more the supply is limited and the more demand on a limited supply, the higher whatever the price should be. So the argument is made that if you want to cap greenhouse gas emissions and you keep lowering the amount of emissions that are permitted, you're essentially restricting the supply of space in the atmosphere that can be polluted. And consequently, the use of that space for people who either want to or must or are corrupt and want to continue polluting, it's going to cost them more and more. And if you don't have that cost built in there, they will keep polluting because there wouldn't be any reason not to, except regulatory control. And obviously, the climate change problem has escaped regulatory control. There's just not enough regulation at the moment. So cap and trade is a supplement to regulation, really, and is its own kind of regulation. Most of it is, if it's mandatory, it can work. If it's not mandatory, there's an open question.
You also mentioned discussing basically climate change as kind of an accounting problem versus a problem with capitalism. I think that's an interesting frame as well.
Well, I mean, I'm not an apologist for capitalism. Capitalism is based on extraction, or has been based on extraction and abuse and waste, really, up to now, and other things too. But I've kind of come to the conclusion that, on the other hand, it is the prevailing economic system, and we've done experiments with other economic systems. And for various reasons, capitalism is still standing. And capitalism is nothing more than a pool of capital, and it can be driven. It can be driven by greed, and it can be driven by other things. And so the argument I'm making is that we have to drive it for reasons other than greed and other than profit. Now, profit, other than profit alone, but profit is not per se bad, especially if it's not made on the backs of other people. And it's being made on the back of nature. Nature is the big unpaid laborer. Nature is the exploited worker. Nature is not in a union. Nature is the thing that keeps working for us for free. And so if we're going to write capitalism, let's say, RIGHT, one way to write it is to pay nature for the work it does. And also, that's a structure people understand. There is a structure, there are institutions, there are securities regulations, there are vehicles, bonds, indices, there are tools that could be used for purposes other than the ones that they were created for. And so we have a toolbox as compared to kind of a cosmic philosophical toolbox that we've been trying for 30 years. Do you want to wake up in the morning and say, oh, yeah, climate change, the existential threat that I can't wait to take on. I can't wait to get out of this bed and take it on. Nobody feels that. Whereas if you're an investor and you can put some money into a clean tech fund or some of the new things that I talk about in the book, the forest resilience bond and so on, that's exciting. And so it's just about shifting capital, I think, from one thing to another. And I'd rather try that than continue to despair and complain, really, because there's just too much money that could be shifted to leave to other people to talk about.
I love it. And in reading the book, every chapter has a specific target. And I think it was just fascinating to look at all these mechanisms that could be used to maybe fix the issues that we're dealing with. And so there's rhino bonds, reef insurance, carbon trading, art in a box that explain some of this stuff, forest bonds. And all these are clever financial instruments to try to measure future value and, to a certain extent, this ecosystem services. I'm wondering, though, that it's still trying to measure something that's priceless. And I think that that's, as you point out in the book, that's really difficult to do. And I'm wondering if you worry these mechanisms are too complicated because of how complicated understanding interconnected ecosystems actually is.
No, because although everything is interconnected, the way to address preserving the interconnectedness is to sort of disaggregate in a way. And this is what's the fascinating part. On some level, you have to understand environmental issues as ultimately completely integrated and everything is connected. However, that is out of alignment with the way our systems work and the way the physics of the problem work. There's sectors, and even though, what do they people call them, silos now, everything is siloed and we keep trying to connect the silos, but you can only go so far with connection before you can't implement. And, like take a city has to run. It's all well and good to talk about recycling, but at the end of the day, somebody has to pick up the recyclables. That's a driver, that's a vehicle, that's, segmented function. Nature has segmented functions. And what we're pricing really are those functions, those benefits that accrue from nature's work. So I'm not saying nature is worth X. I'm saying the benefits that nature provides can be quantified. And the ultimate result is pricelessness, but you can break it down into quantifiable numbers. And so, for example, back to using tools that everyone's familiar with, and I mean by that, everyone who, manages money, regulates banks, and so on, profit and loss statement. Even I don't have a big company, but I know my red ink and my black ink. And so Puma, which is everybody, I think, recognizes that brand, it's sneakers and soft and sportswear. The company was run at it for a certain time by a quite visionary guy named Jochen Zeitz, Zeitz, who, among other things, endowed a contemporary art museum in Cape Town. And I met him in New York a number of years ago, and I could tell that he had something, going. He was talking about this environmental profit and loss statement that he was trying to develop for his company, and he did it. And it was in exactly the format of a normal profit and loss that you would report to your shareholders or to your securities regulators, and it listed all the ways the company made money. I believe that the revenue they projected in the standard profit and L was, I can check that figure, but it's certainly above 200 million euro that year. Then he instructed his team, and they hired an environmental consulting firm at that time called Sustainalytics, a guy named Richard Madison, who is still very active in this and was kind of ahead of his time on these things, to figure out if they had to pay for the emissions that they emitted in the production of their products in a carbon market based on X price, and they used an average price at the time in the European Union system. They figured out, okay, if they had to pay, what would be the value of the land if they were paying for the use of land of the animals that were grazing, who provided the leather, let's say, what would that be? What's the disposal charges? What would the water be? So they started adding all the inputs as if they would have had to pay for them if they had been controlled in some way. And he called that, negative profit. And that would have been what they would owe nature. And that was almost 140, I think it was 145 euro. So if they had been paying actually the real costs to nature for the inputs that they needed and the impacts they were having, negative impacts, their profit would have been significantly reduced. And at which point the company would be exposed as kind of falsely subsidized. And, the shareholders would have freaked out. I mean, what happened to your profit? Oh, my goodness, we owe that to nature. Well, what does that mean? So, if every company did that, even if it was just as an educational tool for the company, eyes would open. And waste would be reduced. I mean, waste is one of our biggest problems. We go after everything else, but waste we're not really focused on. And that would be, energy efficiency. You can never have enough. Cities are, for example, great places to really get to 100% efficiency, but we don't because it's so difficult to retrofit and reorganize cities. But in theory, cities should be the most efficient places on earth to live in terms of certainly energy use.
I think that's a really fascinating idea of making land kind of understood as an asset, as capital, not something that's just raw material and extracted. And I think you mentioned this in the book. But I think that that's a really important distinction in how you can actually price some of these quote unquote externalities that businesses might see and actually, give a way to, value these places.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a simple switch from, infrastructure. Infrastructure is the word, that nature is an indispensable bit of infrastructure. And if you did total up all the contributions it makes to the world economy, the range of estimates is the low ball of 44 trillion per year. And the high ball that I know of, 125 trillion a year, which is more, if you consider today's GDP for the world, it'd call it around 110 trillion a year. Nature is at least is at least responsible for half or comparable in value to half of that. So it can't just be that these are raw materials, because raw materials get exhausted. So if you're getting that kind of subsidy every year, you're exhausting the things you're eating your young, and that just can't go on. And Partha Dasgupta has called it, he's a renowned economist, wrote the Economics of Biodiversity report. We're in a state of environmental depreciation. So if you think of nature as infrastructure, it's an asset and it's depreciating, and we're not doing anything to maintain it or arrest that depreciation. I mean, infrastructure is deteriorating in the United States and we're freaking out. We just put trillions of dollars into the infrastructure bill to try to fix roads and bridges, which are crumbling. They have fallen down. And nature, we're not looking at from the point of view of infrastructure. So if we just kind of shifted our thinking, just a few words, this is not a cost center, this is an asset, and booked it as an asset. Bookkeeping is very important in here. That enlightened me because, you think about bookkeeping and carbon accounting, people who are looking for jobs. Carbon accounting is like one of the most exciting fields you can go into right now for precisely this reason that we're talking about. What is a ton of carbon worth? And how do you prove it? How do you back it up? And by a ton of carbon, I mean an occupancy fee for 1 ton of carbon to be emitted into this extremely scarce space.
Another thing about the book that was really interesting to me was the history, the process of thinking about pricing and politically how things have happened over the many years. that have taken us one way or another. And I'm wondering, a lot of the things that happened through the 2000s and early 2010s kind of changed the trajectory of where we were going versus where we are now. And I'm wondering, how much of a sliding doors moment was the death of Waxman Markey in 2010? Because I feel like in the book, it's mentioned a number of times, if this would have happened, then maybe the Chinese would have been more active. If this would have happened, your Chicago exchange might not have gone to the wayside and other things would have happened. And so I'm wondering kind of how that tipping point kind of related to where we are now.
Yeah, I would say that was a pivotal moment and unfortunately one of the biggest steps backward on a number of fronts. I mean, one, at the political level, getting Waxman Markey across the line in the House was a triumph of bipartisanship. And, you had a Democratic president and vice president, but you had a Democratic Congress. But I was lobbying every single day. Everybody understood there would be a potential upside for a carbon price. And we worked the issue, and Waxman and Markey worked the issue. So politically, it was a moment of very important bipartisan moment that then fell backward when it didn't get into the Senate and didn't pass. Also, you had momentum for a carbon price coming from every sector. You had big agricultural interests, farmers who wanted a carbon price. They wanted a carbon price because they could sell offsets into it. Midwestern farmers who today don't get much at all for, the climate mitigation services they're doing. And politically, you had it at that time, again, you can never have everything at the same time. But at that time, you had a situation in China. I just heard today that China has more solar power energy capacity than any other country in the world. I mean, they are leading every single green energy, green technology sector there is. And then, however, they weren't leading. And they had a reason to compromise and a reason to work with the United States because ultimately they wanted to learn and mimic. And I could see that in the carbon market experience that I had. When we launched, it was the first carbon market in China, the Tianjin Climate Exchange in 2008, based on the idea that Waxman Markey would be coming in. We would go to meetings, and I talk about this in the book. It was so fascinating. We'd go to meetings, and we would be negotiating a contract. There'd be 5 of us or 4 of us on one side of the table, the Chinese officials, corporate officials working with us, or on the other side of the table. And behind them were like 20 or 30 people sitting there. And I always wondered, who are they? They can't all be like, who are these people? And I realized now they were students and young professionals who worked in PetroChina, the largest oil company nominally in China at that time by market cap, one of the world's biggest oil companies. And what are they doing? Trying to set up a carbon market? Well, to learn. And behind the CEO was 20 or 30 people that he wanted to learn. 1, how to deal with Westerners. 2, what's carbon markets. 3, how to do a contract negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. And all those people are now running carbon markets in China. Whereas we are in deficit. We don't have a generation of people who are thinking about carbon accounting necessarily the way they do. So the failure of Waxman Markey really meant that China and the United States were locked into competition rather than collaboration. And we lost a decade at the very least in terms of not only pricing carbon, but the purpose of pricing carbon is also to incentivize, and even I forget to mention this, to incentivize alternatives to fossil fuels, to make it so expensive to keep using fossil fuels that there is an incentive to do the otherwise. And without that national carbon price, you don't have as much incentive. And even the infrastructure bill and the IRA focused on carrots that don't come along with any downside in the sense of a price. So it's a direct subsidy as compared to, a kind of choice. And it's very important to have people making choices and making decisions because that means that they're paying attention.
That was a frustrating part, I think, for all of us that were paying attention to the infrastructure bill was just the lack of thought on that front, I think. Because for us, we wanted them to do fix it first. We wanted them to focus on reducing VMT, thinking about ways to reduce the impacts of climate change. And instead, there's just money going to state DOTs that are continually expanding roads. And this was a fight that was happening politically. I mean, Caputo in West Virginia and even Mitch McConnell were pushing back when folks in the FHWA were writing memos saying that, we need to focus on reducing emissions from our highway expansion. So how is that political part get into this as well? I mean, we just talked about the change and not being able to get it over Waxman-Markey over the hill, but that change politically that's been happening as well in terms of people, how they see carbon markets, how they see ESG, the back and forth that continues, it seems to be hindering some of the advancements that we've made.
Yeah, well, I mean, everything now is tainted one way or another. Everything is either red or blue. And, that is extremely dangerous for political reasons, but also for environmental reasons, because just take ESG, $1 in $3 is screened for an ESG impact now, which it used to be higher, but it's only looks like a downturn because they changed some of the labeling. But $1 in $3 is roughly screened for an ESG component. And who's screening it? Investors. It's not a do-good group of people. They're screening it because they need to understand what the money is doing relative to environmental risk, social risks, and governance risks. Are boards paying it? Because there are liabilities now and disruptions of supply chains and things from weather. So company boards and investors are paying attention. So it's kind of insane that officials in government would try to prohibit the free market from choosing where to invest. And so prohibiting, say, in Florida, that pension funds can look at ESG even is a bit counterproductive to the whole idea of capitalism and highly politicized and really inconsistent with reality, because in Florida, you can't even get flood insurance now. And so how does that make sense that you would prohibit the Florida pension fund from investing or looking into investing in companies or technologies that bear the ESG label when in your state, your citizens can't get flood insurance anymore and would be benefiting from better building standards, better materials, and all the things that ESG is trying to advance, even allowing for some greenwashing, and nothing's perfect, right? So I think the political situation today is very, very dangerous for the environment for those reasons. But also, I think we've overcomplicated it in many ways ourselves. I say the environmental movement, we have not put jobs creation at the front of the story, which it should have been as of 25 years ago, for sure. When you think about it, I remember having many conversations with colleagues saying, well, if we talk about jobs, it makes it sort of, everyday and pedestrian. Nature is, this big metaphysical thing, and we should preserve it for its own sake. Well, that was a luxury position. And, in fact, the really extraordinary power of nature is that it is also, to protect it is a job. It's a jobs creator. And today that would be everything from smartware, new materials. I read this amazing piece about the toucan's beak, that the structure of the toucan's beak was so incredible that, was almost totally bulletproof. People were studying the cellular structure of the toucan's beak to develop materials that would mimic that strength and be very light. Obviously, toucan has to fly, so how heavy can the beak be, right? Mm-hmm. And so we failed to kind of excite people about the career and blue collar, white collar. And I think that was a political error too, because all well and good to say, well, shut down the coal plants and coal mines. But we've seen the politics of that, where West Virginia, people have a right to be feeling insulted. I'm not saying the politics are all correct. I'm just saying that if you don't put people first, you don't get political support, bottom line. And environmental movement has not broadened its political support. And I think the way to do that is to put jobs first. Now, what has happened, you've got more concern, you've got more worry. But one of the things I learned from Cousteau is people protect what they love and not much more. They don't act out of concern. They act out of love, and they act out of empathy, and they act out of appreciation of beauty. And the people who act out of concern, usually the people who are officially required to act out of concern, like a firefighter or a mayor or somebody whose job it is to act. But the ordinary person doesn't really do much out of fear. It's not a good motivator.
Now, you had a disagreement with the Pope. It's something that I heard my mom say a few times, my Italian-Irish mom say a few times when I was younger. But what did you disagree with him on initially?
So that was during the Paris conversation. So back to your question about Waxman-Markey, turning points. So Paris was, I knew, going to be a turning point. It was COP21, the 21st year after the first 5 years after the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the international agreement that holds all of the UN negotiations together. It's the fundamental document. So for 25 or so or 30 years, we've been talking about dealing with climate change at the political level. And there were these turning points. And Paris was going to be the next big one because the science was such, and there was an attempt being made, and I knew the people involved, to get every single country to put into the Paris Agreement a commitment that they would act and that they would take on a commitment to climate change, which prior to that, the developing countries were given an exemption, and then the developed countries, back to Waxman-Markey, said, well, we're not going to act if every other country's not acting. So there was an impasse. So Paris was going to break this impasse by getting universal acceptance of agreements from every country in the UN. And so what happens? The Pope puts out this encyclical, Laudato Si, Our Common Home, about which makes the case very eloquently that the atmosphere and all of the attributes of nature belong. He didn't say belong, our common heritage and really need to be protected. And it was pleading with more or less the governments to actually do something. And he intended that document to add the weight of his voice to the political process. However, within the document, there were a couple of paragraphs that condemned really carbon markets. And I felt that carbon pricing was essential to breaking this impasse and getting countries to make a commitment because of the upside and downside that we've been talking about. And in fact, at that point, I think over 50 of the what were then those the called nationally determined contributions. And before the agreement was signed, they were called intended national contributions. So I think a significant number above 50 had already talked about using carbon pricing and carbon markets to meet the commitment they were intending to make at Paris. So I thought if the Pope is condemning this carbon market and all these countries are interested in using them, we're going to set the thing back. So I decided to see if I could change his mind on that and see if I could get the Pope to unsay what he said, even though I knew that, first of all, it was published, and secondly, the Pope's supposed to be infallible. And so how can he unsay what he just said? So I figured out a way to work it. And I tell that story in the book. But the main thing was I kind of continued and continued. I wrote the Pope and I met his top cardinal, Cardinal Turkson. He said more or less what I just said. Well, we can't really change I hear you. I mean, they understood. The Cardinal Turkson heard what I was saying. He said, but, it's done. It's done. And I said, well, nothing's ever really done. You have a newspaper. You have the Observatory Romano. You could write an editorial that kind of adds to what the Pope said or somehow expands on what the Pope said. So it's not such a condemnation, but opens the door to some acceptance. And in the end, that's kind of what happened. The Pope did embrace the idea of carbon pricing, as a principle. That was not only me, but other people who spoke about it, including big oil companies. And then the Pope declared the Vatican would become carbon neutral, that was my suggestion, which a number of other people put forward. And so we were able to kind of complement the Laudato Si with other indications that carbon markets were not as bad as originally the Pope had said. So it was kind of a victory, and everybody can learn. So, and it was quite an experience to meet the Pope, I have to say. So I feel happy I did that.
I was impressed. We talk about the atmosphere, pricing carbon, and I think one of the really important parts of the book too is thinking about the oceans and making sure that we include them in our discussions. And so I'm wondering how important it is to include the oceans, because we do talk about the atmosphere a lot. We talk about breathing air and the different emissions, CO2, et cetera, methane. But we don't necessarily talk about how the oceans take that in and how that plays into the climate as a whole. I'm wondering why the oceans are also an important part of the discussion.
Yeah, and you're right. And even I, didn't emphasize enough the role of the oceans. And, as a philanthropy foundation executive, I remember we had a lot of grantees coming in talking about land-based issues and not that many coming in talking about the oceans. And if you talk to ocean advocates, they will say that they've always felt, quote, left out of the climate discussion. But I think that's changed. I mean, obviously, the number one reason is that the ocean absorbs all this heat. So imagine if the ocean wasn't absorbing the heat. I think it's a very high percentage. It might even be as much as 90% of the heat of the Earth is somehow absorbed by the ocean. And consequently, we all know ocean temperature is rising. That is beyond debate. No one can debate that. And so what you have is what we're having, which is these very extreme storms and coral reef bleaching, which is widespread, and dying coral reefs. Half the coral reefs really are dead. It's just tragic to think about. So what can we do about any of that? It's a bit of a mystery. I mean, you can't really unboil the ocean. I don't know where we're going to go with that. The ocean is acidifying constantly. Coral reefs are dying, and back to the coral reef insurance part of that is about buying time so that new coral reef can breed, if I guess that's the word, or horticulturalize in laboratories that are grown to have genetic components that can withstand this higher heat. But that's going to take time. So on one level, it's kind of, I won't say over for the oceans, but mitigating what is going on with regard to climate change in the oceans is very complicated. But what we can do now is rethink our fisheries practices. Most fisheries are under threat. Many of them are basically point of no return. So stronger regulation of fishing, fisheries. And again, you have to watch out. You can't just put people out of work. You have to be able to essentially reverse this negative subsidy understanding so that we're actually subsidizing workers who probably shouldn't be fishing and countries that shouldn't be fishing. And so this gets into the chapter of off limits. It's the same as asking the Congo not to cut the trees down because the rest of the world needs the trees to sequester the carbon, or not to burn the oil that's in the ground. Why would they? I mean, it's one thing to sacrifice a little bit, but that's a very poor country. And why wouldn't we just say the oil in the ground is worth $100 a ton and we're going to pay you for that? $100 a ton for emission. That's sort of reversing lending. Many of these countries are lending to the North. It's not, and they're the creditor country. We should be in debt to them. But finally, on the oceans, the really big test, and back to ESG, is going to be deep sea mining, where you have these manganese nodules. And back to Cousteau, I think I wrote an article about manganese nodules in that first book that I worked on, which was the late 80s. We knew then that there were these amazing things underwater that were called manganese nodules that have like 4 very important metals, lithium, cobalt, manganese, and I forget the fourth, all in one rock. And they're sitting down there, and it's taken thousands of years for them to form, but they're at the very deepest part of the ocean in the farthest South Pacific, around Nauru and elsewhere. And they've been there all these thousands of years. And now suddenly people want to dig into the ocean, scrape the bottoms, shoot the water up to the surface of a ship, sort out the dirt, take the nodules, dump the water back in the ocean, convince everybody else that won't have a negative impact. Because what are we going to use the manganese nodules for? Batteries. And we have to electrify our economy. No doubt we have to, but why don't we deal with waste on land first? Number one. Number two, are we figuring the costs properly? And number three, do we need all these gadgets? I mean, it's one thing to take manganese nodules and electrify a city. It's another to take manganese nodules from the ocean and give me an iPad that is, marginally faster and has 2 hours more battery capacity than the one I had last year. And that's insane and selfish.
Yeah. I often get depressed because my job is to pull information and share it with my subscribers and listeners, and the sheer volume of doom and gloom every day is a bit much. I've often resorted to skipping articles in my National Geographic because I'm just like, I know this is going to be bad and I don't want to know about it. And so I'm wondering how you deal with kind of that onslaught of information about sadness.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage you not to skip things that have beauty in there. Beauty is the thing to get up in the morning for. But that's kind of what I take some hits about this capitalism angle. But it's what I said earlier. We have the answers. We don't have all the answers, and we don't have the answer. But we don't have to be, prisoners, hostage by these problems. We have the institutions and the systems and the money to address them. And so it's really a matter of how you choose to use your time and also how you choose to use your money. And I think it's kind of empowering to think, when you buy something, anything, to really just take a step back and ask yourself, is this priced properly? Am I getting the value for myself from what I'm paying for this? Why do I willingly pay close to $5 for a kind bar when I'm on the highway compared to $1 in the supermarket? Just that, like $4 I'm paying for the convenience of being able to eat this thing now. And is that a good use of $4? And so you just start training your mind to ask yourself, what is your money really worth? And then what is it doing? And it's not guilt money. It's like, is what I'm spending this on or what my bank is lending to? I give my bank whatever, $1,000 for my checking account. What do they do with that $1,000? It's sort of empowering to kind of think about it in terms of money because it's something you understand. And that helps dilute for me a little bit the fear because I feel there's some tool in my hands that means something. And then the other thing is to believe in decision making. And also, I guess the other thing I try to do is think in terms of a couple of years. Cousteau, when we went to the Rio conference, and sustainable development was the term of art at the time. Sustainable, he would always say, and he said it right to the face of every president and right to the face of Boutros-Ghali and everybody else. Sustainable for how long do you mean? Forever? Nothing is forever. Nobody can give you a definition now of what sustainable meant even then, and let alone now. And what is sustainable? And a sustainable thing is something that's in your control for a few years. So 5 years, what's that? The tenure of a CEO, the time it takes for somebody to move up in a decision-making structure, a board seat tenure, roughly, maybe 10 years. But to think we're going to solve this problem and I'm going to be net zero by 2050, that makes me sad that our goals are so far out. The goals have to be within your control. And once things are in your control, then you feel better. At least that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I think people like having control over things. They understand it. It's why I think a lot of people don't like flying, right? They're not actually flying themselves. They have to depend on somebody else.
Right. You have to choose who you're dependent on. I like to depend on pilots. But, that's why I go back to cities. Cities are a really fascinating organism because, they have to function. That's the truth test. The mayor or the head of the city or the city council has to function. And people can see if it's functioning or not. It's a really very interesting cause and effect kind of setup, I think.
Well, the book is Pricing the Priceless, the financial transformation to value the planet, solve the climate crisis, and protect our most precious assets. Where can folks find the book if they want a copy?
Well, I like to think it's in every bookstore. If you want it, ask in your local bookstore. Certainly the big chains have it, but the independents probably have it, I hope, too. And it's available online through Amazon and all the booksellers online. And Wiley, you can also order it from them. It's out there. So ask for it, and I'd be happy to hear from people about it, too.
Awesome. I really enjoyed reading the book. I go through a number of books and I like them all, obviously, but it's something a little bit different than our usual because of the way we focus on cities and transportation usually. But there were a number of moments when I was reading this and I was like, oh, I need to send this to this person, or I need to send this to this person. I need to share this with other people. So I hope folks read it and I hope they share it with their networks so that we can kind of cross-pollinate to a certain extent on some of these issues. Paula, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And thanks for what you said. I appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.